All right, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, everyone. Yesterday and of course today, we are still working on Surah An-Nisa, and in particular, this page that we're working on. And we talked about the descriptions for munafiqeen. We also talked about the descriptions for those that would engage in Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar, ordering for what is good, forbidding what is evil, and we went in details in that regards. But it was important to talk about, well, ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil, and in short, just to make sure that we're not using such a long sentence every time we talk about this topic. I decided to just say da'wah. And of course, da'wah would actually mean literally to invite, but basically we're just using that as an abbreviation for the word al-amr bil-ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar. And the reason why we wanted to go into that was because the ayah said فَأَعْرِضْ عَنْهُمْ وَعِظْهُمْ وَقُلْ لَهُمْ فِي أَنفُسِهِمْ قَوْلًا بَلِيغًا. And certainly this actually takes us into a number of different topics. If it says فَأَعْرِضْ عَنْهُمْ, well, how are we supposed to engage in ordering for what is good? When do we stay away? When do we actually consider ourselves that we had done what we needed to do, and therefore we could just leave these people? And of course, this takes us into the question of Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy al Munkar and the details of it. But the question also is ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil, or at least what we abbreviated into saying da'wah. What is the ruling in that regard? Why do we even need to do it at all? Do we have to do it? Are we obligated as a general layman to actually do Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar or not? And that actually makes me take you to a lovely article that was actually shared on this page. And this website definitely has a number of different good articles, and it makes things easy for us to actually go back to it, and rather than restart all of our research all over again. But it actually takes us into a very easy and straightforward. I know everything is written in Arabic, but it's important that I would like you to actually see the exact quotations and certainly use the cursor to help you see what I'm pointing to, and therefore be able to see the exact quotation and, of course, the exact wording. It will, inshallah, enhance your ability to understand those words, your, of course, your ilm in Lugha Arabiya as well, and inshallah, you'll be able to see it. So, al-ma'ruf and al-munkar, two definitely opposite words. In other words, basically antonyms. Al-ma'ruf would basically be the opposite of al-munkar, and of course, in that situation, when you're looking at al-ma'ruf, it's basically what humans would know. In other words, it's something that you're familiar with, but it also can be as an antonym to hospitality or whatever you would contribute in, and simply what you would give. Al-Ma'ruf can also be just a general wording to everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded as something that you would basically get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, it's a form of ritual or a form of ibadah or a form of worship. And certainly, same thing when you're talking about al-ma'ruf is not only a way to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but could also be a way to get closer to people. So whether it's getting closer to people or whether it's getting close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's all called ma'ruf. So ma'ruf in where you're, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala orders for the men, and of course the women. Of course, it's always talking about عاشرهن بالمعروف. عاشرهن بالمعروف. It's a different way, and where, yes, you're going to deal with your wife in the way for al-ma'ruf. In other words, to get closer. You're trying to do different things that get you closer to her, that let you recognize the different methods of her psychological state is different from another woman's psychological state. So therefore, when you're talking about il-ma'ruf, is also a way to learn how to get closer to her or get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or get closer to people in general. All right. So everything everything that, of course, in the general statement, everything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or Ishara would be, I would say, a comprehensive wording, everything that Islam or at least Quran and Sunnah would regard as obligatory or something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forbid is basically considered within the parameter of ma'ruf or munkar. So if it's something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had recommended or at least had considered something of having good within it, then that would be ma'ruf. And if something contained evil within it, whether called it something that is haram to do or whether called it something that is abhorrent to do, would actually be considered munkar. So this in general would just be a little intro about ma'ruf. Yet on the other hand, il-munkar. So il-munkar would basically, the singular of it is nukr. And here, لَقَدْ جِئْتَ شَيْئًا نُكْرًا. In nukr would basically be something that is abhorrent, something that is detested. And in that situation, we are looking at the word munkar, which could actually be something that, like we said, al-juhud could be something that you're denying something, and could also be to neglect. Okay, to neglect, to basically avoid, and etc. So everything in general that is shara. Shara would mean anything that is Islam, whether we're speaking about Quran and Sunnah. So this is the abbreviation for shara, to mean the path. And of course, here it's referring to Quran and Sunnah, but whether in regards to one showing some form of detesting, some form of forbiddance, or some form of disliking or not recommending something, would actually be considered as munkar. And of course, munkar to mean it is not liked. Now, the scholars in general had agreed upon that it is obligatory to order for what is good and forbid what is evil. Let's say Ibn Hazm here, my favorite scholar. Now, you all know who my favorite scholar is, not because we share same birthdays, but anyhow, okay. All right, let's see what he had said. Quote, he said, all the ummah unanimously agrees that it is obligatory to order for what is good and forbid what is evil, with no differences of opinions. Let's just go back and see. So he basically had quoted that in this book right there. This book is in approximately 5 volumes. It's a very good book, very detailed in speaking about religions. Let's see, in Nawawi, who's the Syrian scholar, and certainly the most important thing about Nawawi is to remember that Riyadh al-Salihin, he's basically the scholar that compiled it. And he had said that وقد تطابق على وجوب الأمر بالمعروف والنهي عن المنكر الكتاب والسنة وإجماع الأمة. And he said all the different resources within the Quran, within the Kitab, within even the prophetic tradition, and including all the scholars, had all agreed that ordering for what is good and forbidding what is bad had actually that it is actually obligatory. In other words, all the resources would really show that it is obligatory to do. And he said, it is, as a matter of fact, the advice that you would give on the behalf of the religion. In other words, when you're giving an advice, you basically are practicing this ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil. And he said, the only ones to object and disagree that it is obligatory are really the Shia. So Rafida would be the Shia. And he said, and we cannot use their objection as at all something that is considerable. And he said, as exactly what Imam al-Haramain, or Abu al-Mu'ali al-Juwayni, that's basically, he said, and that we cannot actually consider their disagreement, as the Muslims had unanimously agreed that we should not go to such a disagreement, and that it is obligatory based on the resources in the Shara, meaning all these little points right there in Kitab, Sunnah, Ijma', and also, well, Kitab, Sunnah, and Ijma' would actually be considering that it is obligatory. Let's say Abu Bakr ibn Arabi. So we got, let's see, Ibn Hazm, Zahiri madhab, Nawawi, Shafi'i madhab. Let's see, Abu Bakr ibn Arabi, who's Maliki madhab. And let's see, Maliki madhab. He also said in the word, وَلْتَكُمْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٌ, as in Surah Al Imran, that let there be a part of the nation that would order for what is good and forbid what is evil. He said that's an evidence that ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil is actually obligatory, that every Muslim should do, even if, look at this word, وَإِن لَمْ يَكُنْ عَدْلًا. I want you to emphasize this one, because what that means, according to Ibn al-Arabi here, who's Maliki madhab, he actually said that yes, just the wording وَلْتَكُمْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٌ, and let there be a part of the nation that orders for what is good. He said, even if the person is not committed to, at least in practice, implementing the deen itself, then that doesn't mean that they would leave ordering for what is good. But as a matter of fact, he said, even if the person is not abiding by what they're saying, that still does not mean that they would leave ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil. In other words, it would still be obligatory, even if the person is committing major sins, even if the person was committing minor sins. Giving da'wah, giving and ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil is obligatory, even if you yourself are not practicing it. Let's go for another person, Abu Bakr ibn al-Jassas, who is actually a very, let's call him a fanatic Hanafi. He actually said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had affirmed that it is obligatory to order for what is good and forbid what is evil in various ayat in his book. And the Prophet ﷺ had explained it in numerous hadith that are authentic, and in fact the highest level of authenticity, which is called mutawatir, in where it's a group of different sahaba that transmitted it to another group of sahaba or tabi'in, and so forth, till it actually got to us. And he said it was unanimously agreed upon between the scholars, between the great Salaf, which actually means those that had preceded in piety, and even the great scholars in the various areas and geographical areas in throughout the nation, the Muslim nations, that it is obligatory. Let's go back to his book. It's called Ahkam al-Quran. And his book, Ahkam al-Quran, is in almost maybe 3 huge volumes, and sometimes 5 volumes, but just listen to that one. Ishawkani, who basically is a Yemeni scholar, and also, well, he was Zaydi, and then later he became Shafi'i. So he was, at one point, he was actually Shia, and then later he became Sunni. And he said in his book of Tafsir, Fath al-Qadir, he said, this ayah right there in Surah Al Imran, it says, وَلْتَكُمْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٌ يَدْعُونَ إِلَى الْخَيْرِ وَيَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنكَرِ وَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. And let there be a group of, basically a part of the nation, ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil. And of course, and those are the people that are the ones to succeed. When we say succeed, it's basically a general statement to mean that they will make it to Jannah. And he said, in this ayah, there is an evidence that it is obligatory to order for what is good, forbid what is evil. And he said, and that is also evident that it is obligatory even in the Quran and the Sunnah. And it is one of the best good deeds and the best obligations that we would find in the pure Sharia. And it is a very strong basis, and in fact, a very strong pillar within Islam. And certainly this is that pillar in Islam that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had considered what actually brings in consistency, what it brings in enhancement within the community to basically implement the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and even elevate it amongst all. The question is, when they say it's fard, when we say it's obligatory, of course, there are different levels of obligation, and the different levels of obligation would be two kinds. The first kind is called fard ayn. The second kind is called fard kifaya. Let's write that down so we can never forget it. I'm going to write it down so you could all remember it. So the first kind is called fard kifaya. The second kind is called fard ayn. So fard kifaya would mean it's an obligation, but it would more be of a communal obligation. Communal, did I write that right? Communal obligation. Yet, the fard ayn would mean that it's an individual obligation. What does that mean? So individual obligation means each and every single individual but basically have to and is obligated to perform that act. So 5 daily prayers. You cannot hire someone else to do it on your behalf. This is an obligatory prayer in where you as an individual, you would have to do it. Siyam Ramadan. You can't have someone else do it. But there are certain obligations that are communal. In other words, in where if we have an enough group of people doing that particular obligation, well, that would suffice. And we don't have to have every single person, every single Muslim attend to basically practice that obligation. And the best example for that, I guess, is really burial or even Salat al-Janaza or Salat al-Eid. We would basically have to have a number that is equivalent to the necessary basically act in order to have it basically all the rest of the ummah not held accountable. If the communal obligation is not done by an efficient number of people, then in that situation, the whole communal obligation turns into an individual obligation. Let's give an example. We need within the ummah, we need at least depending on the society, all right, we need within the society, let's say we were talking about maybe a certain number per capita, and basically the studies would say we need these number of doctors to be cardiologists within the society to cover the needs. Then in that situation, we have to make sure that we have this number of cardiologists to basically meet the needs for that community, number of hospitals, number of clinics, etc. If the doctors are not there, then in that situation, this becomes an individual obligation where we have to make sure that we are encouraging at least the students, we're putting in, I guess, the investments, the scholarships to make sure that we have enough number of cardiologists. This is just an example, hypothetically speaking, that we would have enough number of people that are there to basically complete and fix or at least close this gap within the society. All right. So this is the difference between communal and obligation and individual obligation. So that's where they actually had differences of opinions. They said, okay, well, we agree that it's obligatory. We're not going to disagree on that. But when we're looking at the piece in where this is fard, does that mean communal or does that mean individual? So let's see. Izzajaj, he actually said, well, what the word minkum, which is basically in quoting, of course, let's take this one out, in where in the ayah, وَلْتَكُمْ minkum, he basically said, well, this minkum in this ayah right there. Now, the word minkum actually means from you. So you had some scholars actually say that this is actually litab'id, minkum to mean from you, to mean a group of people. In other words, making it a communal obligation and not necessarily an individual obligation. Yet here's some other scholars like al-Baghawi. He said, well, this is not to mean this is apart. So that minkum, he said, this is not to say this is a partial statement. In other words, this is not to basically separate or at least divide. This is not to divide, and not always is min to divide. What's the evidence? He said, well, the ayah says, فَجَتَنِبُ الرِّجْسَ مِنَ الْأَوْثَانِ. So min could not necessarily be not necessarily as a partition, but here, just like in this ayah, it says, and avoid all the contamination that is basically within the different idols or within the different deities that people might worship. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't say that certain deities are permissible by all means. Of course not. But this is actually saying that this would include every type of awthan, every type of contamination, in other words, every type of polytheism that al-awthan are doing or are bringing in is basically supposed to be something you're supposed to be avoiding. So not every min is necessary to basically be giving us ifada of a tab'id, or at least a partition. And let's say al-Qurtubi, on the other hand, he says وَمَعْنَهُ أَنَّ الْآمِلِينَ يَجِبْ أَنْ يَكُونُوا عُلَمَاء. So the other scholars that had said, no, this is communal obligation, they basically said, like al-Qurtubi, who's Maliki madhab, he basically says, well, the min here, communal obligation, would actually be referring that they would have to be scholars. And this is not communal obligation for all the people, but this is supposed to be really left for the scholars to be at the forefront, ordering for what is good, forbidding what is bad. And this is not left for any random person to come forward and start correcting people left and right. And here, and he said, وليس كل الناس علماء وقيل لبيان الجنس والمعنى لتكونوا كلكم كذلك. And of course, some scholars actually said, well, this is in order to show the type. In other words, it's basically an inclusive one. An inclusive al, okay, now this is giving me an inclusive al, and not necessarily to basically bring about a partition. And of course, al-Qurtubi said, and what he would regard as preponderant is that ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil is more exclusive to be for the scholars, and therefore it's a communal obligation. All right, now this is just, I'm just going over really quick. Let's see Ibn al-Arabi, and he basically says that it is basically also agreeing with al-Qurtubi, who's Maliki madhab, and he basically says this is communal obligation. Let's see al-Jassas, who is Hanafi madhab. He says, well, what that ayah contains is that number one, it is obligatory to order for what is good and forbid what is evil. And the other one is that it is communal obligation, and not necessarily every single person has to do it. And same thing with Ibn Taymiyyah, who is Hanbali madhab, and he basically said ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil is basically, in that situation, it is communal obligation. So what does that actually mean? Does that mean we should necessarily not do it? Well, some scholars had indicated that it would become an individual obligation, just like in Nawawi here had said, that it would be considered as basically yata'ayyan. Yata'ayyan, in other words, it is now directed at that person in where they're the only ones that are seeing this. They're the only ones that are going to be capable of removing such harm, such as, for example, the person seeing their wives or his wife or even their children or even, of course, their slave right there doing a particular wrong thing and or probably not doing enough to practice what is good. So in that situation, if within your home you're seeing that your children, for example, are hooked on the phone, we're not going to say, listen, this is a communal thing. You're not a scholar. You cannot tell your child not to do the wrong thing because you're not a scholar. So mind you, this is only the scholar's duty and not you. Well, this is actually different because this right there, like in Noah, we had said, this would be an individual obligation. You are the one that is seeing your sibling, your probably your children, your wife, whatever. And in that situation, you would be the person in that circumstance obligated to correct the matter, order for what is good, and bring in a good advice. So the question is, when is ordering for what is good or forbidding what is evil going to be liked? Mustahab. So, in other words, sometimes it's obligatory and sometimes it's mustahab. Sometimes it's liked. So now we're going from the highest level in where we're talking about an obligation to the second level in where we're speaking about something that is liked. So, number one, in situations where the whole city did not leave such a liked thing. So, for example, if we're talking about the whole city leaving Salah, in that situation, that's a completely different thing. Then you would really, even if the communal obligation is not done, remember, if the communal obligation is not practiced, that communal obligation actually becomes individual obligation. Now, keep that in mind. So, if we don't have a good enough number of scholars that are taking the lead to correct, to advise, to teach, to basically bring about an explanation to people in that situation, you as individuals, you would have to take the lead. So you cannot say, well, this is a scholar's duty, not mine. I'll just stay quiet, whatever. It will just wait for a scholar to do his job then. Nope, you would have to take the lead in where bringing in one, educating yourself. And here's one thing. You're never going to reach a level where you're going to call yourself a alim, really, especially during our day and age. It's really hard to reach the level, even if you have a PhD, that doesn't necessarily mean you're a scholar. We're really talabat ilm. Even if you have a PhD, and of course, even if you had memorized the Quran, even if you had that 10 qira'at, etc., yes, you are definitely probably, at a higher level than the rest in terms of maybe knowing about Islam, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that person had become a alim that is, let's call them at the level of the scholars of the past. Very few are actually at the level during our times. So maybe I don't want to generalize too much, but we are right now getting some levels of scholars that are really considered scholars. But of course, we are talabat ilm here. So talabat ilm anywhere, yes, we're taking the time and spending time to learn more about our Islam, and we're all talabat ilm, even if we have PhD in Islamic studies. All right, let's see. So the second one, they basically said if this matter is obligatory or if the person is committing something haram, all right, and of course, if in that situation, by ordering for what is good and forbidding what is bad, they're concerned that they might actually get into a bigger trouble. So let's say they're ordering for what is good, but then, of course, they're afraid that they might actually lose their job. They're afraid to say anything. They're afraid to probably get imprisoned for saying that, etc. That situation, all right, in that situation, we would say not necessarily it becomes liked only, but we would say the least that you could do is not support evil. If you cannot say what is good, then the least that you could do is don't support evil. If you couldn't talk against LGBT and all of that, and you would stand out and you're afraid to lose your job, etc., well, the least that you could do is don't support it. Don't be there in the meetings to support this. Don't be there giving, somehow speaking about it as, yes, we have to be inclusive in creating more and more spaces for these deviant groups. You're at least, if you cannot stand up against this action, well, don't support it. This is not, of course, exclusive to this particular action, but this would be including each and every single deviance. If you couldn't stand up to say, hey, we don't want alcohol served, and you're afraid that you might get not to probably get, I would find it really strange if somebody, it's really strange how some people are just too cowards, too much of cowards, too cowardice. It's really strange how sad a lot of our ummah had become really afraid to stand up to say what is good, what is considered as truth, what is considered as piety. It's really sad that we had become so afraid to stand up, and we're always saying and thinking that I might actually lose my job, I might lose a promotion if I were to say anything. And a lot of times, I'll say it again and again, a lot of times it is not a real threat. It is nothing but, I would say, a ghost that was put and instilled within our hearts, in where they're making you afraid to say what is good, and you actually bought it. You bought it. You had actually absorbed the fear, when in reality, it is not something that they could necessarily stop you from or basically harm you in any way. And I found that many, many, many times, being as a chaplain at St. Catherine University, we had a lot of students that were afraid to say anything. And subhanallah, I mean, there were many times where I remember, so the dean of our university, the dean, she basically, the provost actually, the provost, I was asked to give this lecture on Islam and why Islam is basically stereotyped and all of that. So now it was a whole hour lecture, and this was for all the staff, every single staff, including the professors at the university. And of course, to summarize the lecture, basically the lecture was one, explaining the history for that stereotypical image. Number two, how that stereotypical image had migrated basically with the colonizers, and of course the imperialist attempts in order to basically literally steal the resources for those Muslim countries. And later, of course, those so-called scholars had been literally taken from those colonizers, or from the imperialist agendas, and then later on they're right now presented as really academic resources on Islamic studies. And most of those that are holding degrees in Islamic studies in Western universities do not have a background in Arabic language, do not have a background in studying Islamic resources, and certainly do not have a background in where they're learning or teaching Islamic studies from unbiased resources. And unfortunately, right now, and I had actually said that during that meeting, I said, unfortunately, we're seeing even within our university, and in particular, the theology department and in other departments, departments where they would present themselves as specialists in Islamic studies and literally even and even bully me as a PhD in Islamic studies. And I wonder what would actually happen to the students if I was bullied. What would it be like for the students themselves? After I had finished, I was really ready to get fired. After I had finished, my boss tells me that the provost is calling me to her office. So I go, she's African American, and she said, what did you just say? And I said, well, I'm a specialist in this field. And I said what I needed to say. And she said, I was looking around and waiting to see the remarks and the faces on people's faces, but you had really shredded us into pieces. You had really proven that we were completely ignorant on Islam and that we were nothing but really products to recycling the same stereotypical images. You had really shredded us. That's exactly what she said. And then I said, well, she said, you said you were bullied. How did that happen? So I said the story when one of the students had come up to me and told me that in one of the classes, the theology professor gave them one of the pieces basically to read, and that particular book contained some so-called information. Basically, it's all misinformation that the Prophet ﷺ had plagiarized the Quran from the Bible. So that was basically it. The student wanted to defend the Prophet ﷺ in class, but then, of course, the professor did not want any responses, any rebuttals on the material that she had considered as basically the way to teach these Muslims a lesson and to basically say that the Prophet ﷺ had plagiarized the Quran from the Bible. So the girl came up to me, brought me this, and she said, well, I've got Aysha Wazwaz that could actually come in our class and explain the resources for the Quran. Of course, the professor for that subject, she basically got so provoked, so let's say it, so angry, and she said, basically contacted my professor, or sorry, my boss, and said, well, this chaplain should not be talking and instructing us on how to teach Islamic studies or even how to teach our topics. So basically bullying me and trying to get me out. But then when the provost basically was brought to her, and I said, I just don't want to step on anybody's toes and really push away even a professor in theology and push them away and actually say, well, you don't actually have the right to speak on Islamic studies when you're actually specialized in theology. But the provost told me, she said, listen, you give somebody the warning once and second time, but then if they insist on stepping on your toes, girl, push them away, and you had already warned them not to step on your toes, go ahead and push them. That's exactly what she said. And in the beginning, I really thought that she was going to dislike what I had actually said in the lecture, but that's what I wanted to say. Many times we're creating, I would say, a scarecrow, and the scarecrow is really nothing but a fake thing. The truth of the matter, your confidence will actually take away all those imaginary fears, all those imaginary fantasies, ghosts that you had created, and they don't actually exist. Stand your ground, stand strong, be firm, be confident. Don't worry about the objection. Wallahi, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَيَنْصُرَنَّ اللَّهَ مَن يَنْصُرَهُ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you victory if you give victory to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Don't be afraid. Stand your ground, be strong, and don't worry. Wallahi, wallahi, your own strength would right there shake those confidence that people are portraying, but in reality, it is really fake confidence. They don't have the confidence. They recognize that they're contradicting themselves. They recognize that what they are portraying is nothing but fake evidence. Your confidence will actually shake.
That's how I became Muslim.
Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. And there are so many different stories. I'll tell you, when I actually thought that I was invited to this meeting, it was supposed to be to support the queer and all of that. And then I basically rejected the meeting. And I had sent a whole article explaining it to the dean, to the university, basically president and the provost and all of those, how in my religion that's actually not the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created nature, that's not something that we should at all promote or support, because this is not giving them mental health, but this is actually considered as giving them an illness that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had not created within them. I thought that they were going to be just saying, hey, you're fired. But subhanAllah, I actually had all of them say, well, this is exactly, of course, the university that I was working in was Catholic University, but they actually said, well, thank you for bringing this up. And that's actually what catechism teaches. And they basically supported this. It was really the Muslim students that were afraid. It was really the Muslim students that were afraid. They were the ones that were always, I would say, indoctrinated with the definition of inclusivity and orientation and all of that. And they thought that by disagreeing that they were going to be attacked, or perhaps that's going to affect their grades, or perhaps even affect their schooling, etc. But I'll tell you, it won't. The stronger you stand, the more confident, and certainly the more firm you will actually see that all that scarecrow was really nothing but an imaginary thing. Don't be afraid. Keep going. All right. Of course, it's really important. Let's see. Of course, they didn't know. That's why it's really important to teach the stories of the prophets and the messengers. That's in order to tell you that's how the story began. That's how the story began, which is basically getting rejected, basically getting, of course, probably at times, just like Prophet Ibrahim, just like Prophet Lut, they were definitely exiled, definitely, I guess not only exiled, but also basically tortured. They definitely went through certain things. So yes, I know it can go that far, but the stories in the Quran are to tell you that that's how the story began.
So I did have a couple questions about the last topic that we were doing. Should I wait till the end? Oh, okay.
Yeah, I could see for the Fard Kifaya and Ayn for Jum'ah. How was that during COVID? So during the time of COVID, the story was, I guess, so ambiguous at the time that people didn't really have enough information. There was, I guess, an exaggerated, for who knows what reason, an exaggerated fear in regards to COVID. And of course, they did all that quarantine, stopped all the airports and all of that. It really changed everything. So during COVID, the situation was quite different because in the early times of it, it was quite different because we basically were told that such gatherings were going to be, this hot spot of basically letting this become an epidemic. And then,
that goes back to the legal maxims?
Exactly. It goes back to the legal maxims in where to consider people's lives, and protecting people's lives was considered or is considered always, definitely, is considered our first or at least our second priority. So in that situation,
Okay.
when something like Salat al-Jumu'ah, if there is a fear on the society, we would then basically not call it communal obligation. It basically becomes basically at that moment stopped, and people would basically
Until the
pray.
harm is uplifted.
Absolutely,
Okay.
absolutely. But subhanAllah, I think that that exaggeration in that regards, now they regard it right now, it's like they recognize that it was too exaggerated. Um, anyhow,
Okay.
so of course, ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil. Um, and of course, this was not only obligatory on the Muslim Ummah, that is the nation of the Prophet ﷺ, but this was also obligatory on the previous nations as well. Where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, let's look at this ayah right there, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said, لُعِنَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا بَنِي إِسْرَائِيلَ عَلَى لِسَانِ دَاوُودَ وَعِيسَى بْنِ مَرْيَمَ ذلك بما عصوا وكانوا يعتدون كانوا لا يتناهون عن منكر فعلوه لبئس ما كانوا يفعلون. I want to look at this ayah and kind of scrutinize it right there. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had cursed those that had disbelieved from the children of Israel at the basically at the words, by the words of Prophet Dawood and Isa ibn Maryam, for the basically the disobedience that they had committed anywhere they did not. كانوا يعتدون وكانوا يعتدون. In other words, they were transgressing the limit, and لا يتناهون. I want to look at this one, that they did not forbid one another in doing what is wrong. And of course, certainly لبئس ما كانوا يفعلون, and this is definitely the worst of what they had actually committed. In other words, they weren't just doing what is considered haram, but they did not even have anybody that was standing at the forefront to forbid them, or at least order them to do what is right. So here, of course, what they were considered as the biggest sin that they had committed is not the sin, because we're all sinners, but the biggest sin that they had committed was really emphasized here, that they did not engage in ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil. And that is what actually made them basically deserving the punishment. Let's see this ayah in right here in Surah Al-Ma'idah. So the previous one was in Surah Al-Ma'idah 78, and of course you could see the paradigm in that surah, in Surah Al-Ma'idah, where it's really bringing in that emphasis that by leaving what is good and forbidding what is evil within the society would basically mean that that society would be whether, of course, susceptible to getting a complete and a severe punishment. Let's look at this ayah. And وترى كثيرا منهم يسارعون في الإثم والعدوان وأكلهم السحت لبئس ما كانوا يعملون لولا ينهاهم الربانيون والأحبار عن قولهم الإثم وأكلهم السحت لبئس ما كانوا يصنعون. So what happened? He said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and you would see many of them, they would rush in committing what is a sin or what is a transgression or even aggression. And they would even take or even eat up or swallow up. And of course, this is a metaphor, basically the money that does not belong to them. And this is, of course, the لبئس ما كانوا يصنعون, which is basically an indication that was an abhorrent action to do. And then the ayah says لولا. Now this لولا actually means that didn't happen. That, in other words, this didn't happen. Same thing when we're talking about Surah Yusuf, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically says the same thing, in where همت به وهم بها لولا أن رأى برهان ربه. So he didn't necessarily have feelings for the woman because لولا. So this لولا would mean لولا أن رأى برهان ربه. In other words, if he hadn't seen the signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he would have actually had feelings for her. But this لولا would mean that this was not actually true. If, in other words, if basically ينهاهم الربانيون, if the rabbis and the scholars had forbid them from basically saying what is wrong or even eating up and taking all the money that doesn't belong to them, then لبئس ما كانوا يصنعون. In other words, the worst thing that they had committed is that their scholars and their rabbis, or basically those that were supposed to be the scholars to read and have the ilm, didn't actually do their duty in bringing about the knowledge, or even forbidding that evil, the sin, emphasizing what is a sin and what is not a sin, or even forbid them and explain to them why this is haram and what they should be doing in order to stay away from this. And of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala emphasized that the worst, what is even worse than the sin itself, is basically the abstinence, or at least that the scholars themselves, whether the rabbis or the scholars themselves, they were not doing their job in clarifying and certainly in bringing in the awakening. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says لَبِئْسَ مَا كَانُوا يَصْنَعُونَ, in where it basically emphasized that this was actually a major sin, and no less than the sin of committing the sin and the aggression itself. And of course, al-Qurtubi here says, and this ayah emphasizes that leaving, ordering for what is good and forbidding what is bad, is basically committing a major sin. For the ayah was basically right there bringing tawbih lil ulama. So tawbih is a form of rebuke to the scholars for leaving, ordering for what is good and forbidding what is bad. You could see this is basically what al-Qurtubi had emphasized. And certainly this is not an order only during our times, but this is an order that we would basically have to abide by even as Muslims. It's basically the same exact order, in where we can't say, well, this was something that they were ordered in the past and therefore doesn't include us, but this is in fact to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned the story in order to let us know the emphasis, the importance, and certainly the weight that it basically carries within the society, and that ordering for what is good and forbidding what is bad, or da'wah itself, is actually a reason to gaining nobility, is basically sababun fil khayriyah. And where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even said for the ummah, for the Muslim ummah, kuntum khayra ummatin ukhrijat linnas تأمرون بالمعروف وتنهون عن المنكر وتؤمنون بالله. Basically said in regards to the ummah, you were the best nation that it was basically sent to the people, ordering for what is good and forbidding what is bad. And you would believe in Allah. What is that supposed to emphasize? Well, that's basically to tell us all that in order to be the best of the nations, you would not be the best of the nations if you had actually left the main commandment in that, basically that conditioned commandment, or that conditioned reason to be the best of the nations, which basically would mean that you would order for what is good and forbid what is evil and believe in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this basically is conditioned, and right there, the condition to believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and ordering for what is good and forbidding what is bad is basically to tell us that for us to say it's a communal obligation, and to basically leave the individual obligation is certainly, I guess sometimes we're misunderstanding it. And that's why when we're speaking about ordering for what is good, and we've got actually at different levels. So a level in where something that may have differences of opinions, I'll leave that to the scholars. But if something is so obvious, we already know. I'm seeing, let's say, somebody drinking alcohol. Am I going to say, well, I'll just leave that to the scholars to say something about it? I'm not a scholar. And the ayah says, وَلْتَكُمْ مِنْكُمْ. So this is communal obligation, not me. No, in that situation, this is a direct thing in where there's no differences of opinions. This isn't communal obligation. This is individual obligation. The communal obligation would be in where you're teaching about Islam, differences of opinions. You're here researching and talking about the differences of opinions, or at least what is preponderant. That's the communal obligation left to the scholars. But if something is so obvious, something is so straightforward in Islam, zina is haram. You're not going to say, well, I'm going to let someone else talk about it. I'll just, yeah, they're doing zina. Okay, I'll just let the scholars talk about it. I have nothing to do with this. Absolutely not. You misunderstood the communal obligation. So, individual obligation, if you are seeing something that is obviously haram, you stand up and actually talk about it, whether you're a scholar or not. To give da'wah at a booth, to stand up. I don't know, you're buying something, or you're basically in a parking lot and you basically seize the moment to give da'wah. You can't say this is communal obligation. This is basically the scholar's obligation, but this is our every Muslim's obligation, in where to deliver Islam, to deliver da'wah, to order for what is good and what is evil, and forbid what is evil, is basically a individual obligation whenever you're capable of doing it. All right. So we just want to make sure that we are clear on that, and then we don't basically take away all the power and all that enthusiasm to talk about Islam. Let's see. And when we speak about this act as being one of the main reasons why the ummah would basically be in that nobility, would basically mean that only the people that would basically order for what is good and forbid what is evil would basically be included khayra ummah. In other words, those that are noble would be the ones to practice the da'wah. In other words, the most noble people in the society, in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, are those that would embrace this condition, that would embrace this, let's call it job, this action, in where, of course, you could see Umar ibn Khattab, he basically had done Hajj, and then he had seen that people were just rushing. Then, of course, he said, "من سر أن يكون من تلك الأمة فليؤدي شرط الله فيها." If you wanted to be the best, and of course, be the most noble within the ummah, then it's not enough to say, well, I'm Muslim, I'm basically above all. No, you wouldn't be superior unless you're actually taking that action in giving dawah. So if I'm giving dawah, I could say I'm actually more superior than you. Well, actually, this is speaking about in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is not for you to somehow boast about it around the people. All right. So this is, just to be careful with it. And of course, this isn't just basically speaking about nobility, but this is also to speak about that giving da'wah. Giving da'wah is basically a reason for success, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and let there be a nation ordering for what is good, and of course from you, ordering for what is good, forbidding what is evil. And it said and emphasized, وَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ, and those are the people that would be the ones to be successful. So if you really want to be successful, and what successful means is basically that you would be granted Jannah, you would be basically given the Jannah, in where not only success in dunya, but even success in akhirah. I'd like to emphasize, subhanallah, in terms of success, the best and the easiest way to really raise your children is let your children be involved in seeing you ordering for what is good and forbidding what is bad. I think I would say the most person that inspired me to really study Islam and even engage in dawah is really, I would say, really my mother. And my mother was always, wherever we would go, she would always have all these pamphlets in her bag or in her purse, and in all these languages, and basically passing it out here and there. I'd like to share something about you, something with you on Islam, and would basically pass it out here and there. Me, on the other hand, in the beginning, I was really shy to stand up and really start a conversation with these strangers. But it wasn't until I had really seen my mother inspire me that don't be afraid. It could be a word that you might tell somebody, a good word here and there that might actually change their life. So don't be afraid to speak about Islam. Don't be shy to, and don't say, well, I'm basically somebody that is an introvert, etc. No, this is the, let's call it the cage that you caged yourself with. But this could actually be a wild card where the Prophet ﷺ said, if somebody is guided through you, it is better for you than all the different treasures in this world. What more do you want? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you just to guide one person, and you never know. You never know who basically will find guidance. It could be just a word that you might have said. And subhanAllah, you don't have to be a scholar. You don't have to be a scholar to do dawah. Sometimes, just remember that Abu Bakr as-Siddiq was actually the cause for almost 9 people to basically be promised Jannah. And that was in the early times of Islam. And we're talking about the early times of Islam where not really much was actually known about Islam. Really, the information about Islam was so, I would say, in its early times, and where it was really just tawheed, just relating it to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, relating our life to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and believing in the Prophet. That was really all the information. All the information about fiqh, all the information about do's and don'ts wasn't even yet revealed. But he was actually the cause for 9 people to be promised Jannah. And this is actually to teach us that you don't necessarily have to be a scholar to bring about guidance to people, to stand on a booth and just say something like, hey, would you want a Quran? Would you like to take a copy? Have you ever read about Islam? Hey, just a small word, and you never know who is going to be guided through that. In the beginning, you might be afraid and you're like, what if I would get rejected, etc. But it's not what if I would get rejected. What if you got accepted is the question. Don't get yourself into a negative perception. But what if you got accepted and you had somebody right there actually say, hey, I'll do the shahada? Subhanallah, I never thought some of these videos were going to be heard by people in India. I've actually had somebody contact me on Instagram from India, say that he was Hindu and would like to become Muslim. And I was really surprised. So why are you contacting me then? And he was fascinated by the lectures that I was giving, which basically I always thought were boring. I don't blame you. but at the end of the day, even if you thought that they were boring, or you thought it was fun, at the end of the day, subhanAllah, it's a skill. You might not have the skill for being attractive or attracting to people and being attractive, I guess, in your method, but giving the dawah is not necessarily conditioned by having the most attractive way. This is basically something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will determine. This is something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had given certain people, I guess, a potential, a skill that didn't give others. But at the end of the day, you do your part. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward you for the effort and not necessarily for the number of people that would embrace or accept your da'wah. Just by you saying, Ya Allah, I want you to see me. I did my role. I tried to do this. Even if only 9 people join, or even if 1 person joins, at the end of the day, Ya Allah, I want you to see that I tried to do this. I want you to see that I was basically doing the duty that you had asked me to do. Yes, this is my capacity. I don't necessarily have the method and the skill like other people do, but this is what I can do. Ya Allah, see me at this moment that I did what I can. Ya Allah, let me be part of those that are included in the ayah in where you had said, أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. I tried. And that's all you need to do. You don't necessarily have to be a scholar, just do and engage in that. Now, of course, you want to keep in mind that ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil is basically the prophet's mission, and you hold on to the prophet's mission. And of course, if you basically do a certain behavior, you do a certain action, that action is going to determine what skill and certainly what mission and how you're labeled. In where we're not talking about labeled in this dunya, yes, you're labeled PhD or labeled a da'i or whatever it is. We're actually talking about labeled in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you're labeled as part of those that ordered for what is good and forbid what is evil, or you're labeled as part of the salihin, or you're labeled as part of those that carried on the prophet's mission. Allahu Akbar. Let's say here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says الذين يتبعون الرسول النبي الأمي الذي يجدونه مكتوبا عندهم في التوراة والإنجيل يأمرهم بالمعروف وينهاهم عن المنكر. Now you could see this as in Surah Al-A'raf, in where it was actually giving a prophecy in the Torah. But there's something rather interesting in that prophecy, in where it says those that would follow the prophet, that is the illiterate prophet that they would find is written and prophesied with them in their own scriptures in the Torah and certainly in the Gospels, in where it was emphasizing that he was ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil. And therefore, you could see that the whole emphasis, even in the prophecy, in where those that would follow the prophet, those that would be part of the ummah, they were actually engaging not in an individual, not only as individuals in where, yes, they believed and that's it, but they were all doing this communal service as individuals, in where they were ordering it, where the prophet himself, yes, ordering for what is good and forbidding what is bad. But here it says yattabi'un, they were following the prophet themselves, they were engaging in the prophetic mission in ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil. It wasn't just the prophet himself, but it was a communal service. It was everybody's mission. And that's why when you look at all of those descriptions, that's really in order to encourage us to embrace such a mission. Let's see, Ata ibn Yasar, of course, he basically said, I had come across Abdullah ibn Amr, who's actually a Sahabi, and he told him, tell me about the the description of the Prophet ﷺ that is written in the Torah. And he said, yes, it is actually, he is described in the Torah, and as exactly the same way that the Quran would describe him, in where it says, oh, you, O Prophet of Allah, we had sent you as a witness, as a one to bring glad tidings and to warn, and as a warner, basically, and even حرزا للأميين, and basically a supporter for the الأميين. الأميين, basically the Gentiles, or at least those that are the الأميين, or the Gentiles, or at least the non-Bani Israel, that you are my, and of course this is not an ayah, but this is, he's quoting here that what he had known is written in the Torah. You are my servant, you are my prophet, and I had named you al-mutawakkil, I had named you basically the advocate, as, or named you as, there are these details in where there's the paraclete and all of that. So I'll just leave that. There is a book that I rather found very fascinating. It's basically called Muhammad in the Bible, Abdul Ahad Dawood, who was a priest, a monk, and then later, by going through the Bible, he basically had found Islam and became Muslim. All right, that you would not be hard-hearted and not hard in your way in delivering dawah, that is, and of course not speaking loud in the markets, and would only bring about a retaliation of good rather than evil, and would forgive. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not basically make him die or take him up until he would basically deliver the religion and the principles that are basically deliver and correct the crooked principles. And they would say, there's no God worthy of worship but Allah, and he would open the eyes that would be blind and the ears that would be sealed from hearing, and even hearts that are closed. So let me see this one right there. So this hadith is actually in al-Bukhari. Well, that came to a surprise to me, to be honest. So yeah, I was going to skip this hadith, but then, subhanAllah, it's a hadith in Sahih Bukhari. All right, well, I didn't know that. All right, so Ibn Kathir in his tafsir, he basically said, well, this is the description of the Prophet ﷺ in where he orders for what is good and forbids what is bad. And he said that was basically the way the Prophet ﷺ himself had actually lived his mission. He would only order for what is good and forbid what is evil. As Abdullah ibn Mas'ud had said, I heard, oh, you who believe, and then Abdullah ibn Mas'ud said, whenever you would hear this, then give your tentative attention, because it is basically to give you a good order and basically forbidding you from something that rather basically abhorred or at least evil that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would want to bring about to your attention, that the Prophet ﷺ was actually sent to you in order to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala without associating partners, and certainly forbid or at least stay away from worshiping other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course, that was basically the Prophet's mission, in where the whole Prophet's mission, where وَلَقَدْ بَعَثْنَا فِي كُلِّ أُمَّةٍ رَسُولًا أَنِ اعْبُدُوا اللَّهَ وَاجْتَنِبُوا الطَّاغُوتَ. The main mission was we had sent a prophet onto each and every single nation, semicolon, that you would worship Allah Almighty and you would basically abandon al-taghut. Al-taghut would be any form of transgression. So whether it's a form of transgression in worship or form of transgression in principle. So in other words, you're going immoral, or whether you're going in transgression in your worship or in at least in your faith. So this is taghut would be in faith, and taghut would also be in principle. All right, and this is extremely important to remember, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned the Prophet's mission, and then also brings about that those that would actually embrace ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil would basically be the most noble description for the believers, in where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, let's look at this ayah, and the believing men and the believing women, they would support one another. That's where the ba'duhum awliya awliya would actually mean they are authority over one another, they are supporters of one another, because al-wali would actually mean the person in guardianship, the person in commandment, the person in power, the person in authority. So here you could see that the believing men and the believing women, they're actually on one mission, and that is they're supporters of one another, they're commanding one another, they're basically enhancing and embracing one another to basically do one major mission within the society, which is ordering for what is good and forbidding what is bad. And of course, in order to be strong and not find yourself really slipping in the slippery slope of ordering for what is good and forbidding what is bad, and finding yourself really becoming one of them when you were trying to be at the forefront to get them out of the wrong behavior that they were doing. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically tells you what keeps you strong. Remember, it's the rope. Remember, when there's a slippery slope, there's a rope that you have to hang on to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to make sure that you yourself do not slip in that slippery slope. And that slippery slope requires, in order for you to hang on to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, yuqimuna salah, perform your prayers. That's going to help you get that recharge every single day, and you tune a zakah, and they would basically pay the zakah in order to let go of dunya and connect your investment to the akhirah. وَيُطِيعُونَ اللَّهَ وَرَسُولَهُ, and they would obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his messenger. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, those are the ones, سَيَرْحَمُهُمُ اللَّهُ, those are the ones that would be included in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy. And the Lord Almighty is all wise and certainly all basically not in need of anybody's worship, because he himself is actually self-efficient. So the word Aziz, self-efficient. And similarly, on the other side, you would actually see that the munafiqeen and certainly the munafiqat, in where this ayah says, al-munafiquna wal-munafiqat ba'duhum awliya'u ba'd. Similarly, on the other hand, you would actually see the hypocrite men and the hypocrite women would also be supporters of one another, engaging in a mission that is ordering for what is evil and forbidding what is good. And you could say, because on the other hand, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was what was actually going to enhance your ability, enhance your commitment in order for what is good. It's basically these points, whether it's salah or whether it's zakah or obeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. On the other hand, what's actually making the munafiqeen and the munafiqat stick to the wrong evil doing that they were doing was basically يَقْبِضُونَ أَيْدِيهِمْ. They basically were so stingy. They didn't want to contribute in the akhirah, so they were just wanting to save it for this dunya. And plus, on the other hand, for the believers, يُقِيمُونَ الصَّلَاةَ, on the other side, المنافقين نسوا الله فنسيهم. They had forgotten Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forgotten them. Well, this is actually not an accurate translation to say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forgotten them, because in English, the word forgotten would actually mean that the information becomes unaware to you, or you're unaware of that information. فنسيهم here basically would mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forgotten them, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had neglected them, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically taken them out of his consideration. إن المنافقين هم الفاسقون. That munafiqeen الفاسقين. What is al-fasiq? Al-fasiq comes from the root fasaqa. The root fasaqa actually means to peel the fruit. Once you peel the fruit, then you basically make it rotten faster. It would rot faster. It would basically start to get exposed to the different bacteria, etc., and not live longer. And that's the same thing. When you basically stay away from remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and basically this commitment of embracing the Prophet's behavior, the Prophet's mission, ordering for what is good, what that makes you becoming is really susceptible to all the different contaminations that are around you. And that's why the word fasiqun, in other words, in order to not be susceptible to that contamination that surrounds you within the environment, if you're not leading others, then you become somebody else's product. This is important. This is what al-fasiqun would actually mean. In other words, if you're not taking in the role, you become susceptible to joining in al-munafiqeen wal-munafiqat, exactly like a fruit that basically is peeled, in where it doesn't have the peel to protect it. It becomes susceptible to rotting faster. It becomes susceptible to basically within hours, you're going to find yourself really at the other end, in where it's all going to be the flies coming at you. It's basically the stinky smell, and of course you're running. وَعَدَ اللَّهُ الْمُنَافِقِينَ وَالْمُنَافِقَاتِ وَالْكُفَّارَ نار جهنم خالدين فيها هي حسبهم ولعنهم الله ولهم عذاب مقيم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said that he had promised the munafiqeen, basically the hypocrite men and the hypocrite women, and even al-kuffar, Notice that the munafiqeen were actually mentioned even prior than the kuffar, that they had been promised hellfire where they would stay in it eternally. And that is basically their ending. And the Lord Almighty la'anahum. La'anahum would basically mean, yes, he had cursed them, but it would also mean that they would not be included in the Lord Almighty's mercy and him embracing them with his acceptance or even mercy. All right. And let's say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had also in another ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala praised those that would engage in ordering for what is good. And he said, التائبون العابدون الحامدون السائحون الراكعون الساجدون الآمرون بالمعروف والناهون عن المنكر والحافظون لحدود الله وبشر المؤمنين. And this is in Surah At-Tawbah. And of course, mind you, Surah At-Tawbah is basically the most important surah that talked about the munafiqeen and talked about the different details in regard to the munafiqeen. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned those that repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, those that are in constant worship, those that are in constant praise to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, those that are in constant obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and those that are in constant ruku'ah or prostration to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and those that would order for what is good and forbid what is evil, and those that preserve the limits and boundaries of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and bring glad tidings to the believers. What is that supposed to be saying? That those are the people that would actually be included within the glad tidings for the believers. In other words, this is in order to bring about an indication on who really deserves this call out. And it's kind of like saying, all right, everybody, and the winners are, and I would like to tell you that the winner is basically going to get a trip to this and a trip to Jannah, or it's going to be an eternal stay in Jannah. And the people that are going to get to this reward are 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's basically what that means in our times today. This is how we would present it. And where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says those that would be, the word is مكناهم في الأرض أقاموا الصلاة وآتوا الزكاة وأمروا بالمعروف ونهوا عن المنكر ولله عاقبة الأمور. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says those that they would be given, the word مكناهم, they would be given authority, they would be given power, those that were granted some kind of, at least some kind of an authority, some kind of a potential, they would use it for, number one, to perform salah, to give zakah, and order for what is good and forbid what is evil, because they recognize that the consequence and basically the conclusion to all the matters basically goes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, he's the one that judges on all the different matters. And of course, in order to basically order for what is good and forbid what is evil, remember this hadith. The Prophet ﷺ, look at this hadith. He said, مثل القائم على حدود الله والواقع فيها كمثل قوم استهموا على سفينة فأصاب بعضهم أعلاها وبعضهم أسفلها or أسفلها. فكان الذي في أسفلها إذا استقوا من الماء مروا على من فوقهم فقال لو أنا خرقنا في نصيبنا خرقا ولم نؤذي من فوقنا فإن يتركوهم وما أرادوا أهلكوا جميعا وإن أخذوا على أيديهم نجوا ونجوا جميعا. What is the story here? The Prophet ﷺ, I'll translate exactly the wordings. He said that he basically had made or given a parable for those that are standing basically on the borders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and those that are within it, exactly like a group that basically went into a ship. And in this ship, you had some people would basically go on to the upper deck, and the other group would basically go onto the lower deck. But then the ones that are in the lower deck, they decided that every single time, of course, they wanted water. They decided, well, if we were, instead of going and asking the people in the upper deck to get us some water, why don't we just basically make a hole inside our lower deck and actually get the water straight right there? And that way we won't harm the people in the upper deck. Now, he says if the people in the upper deck would leave them, or even the ones in the lower deck would leave them, basically decide to make a hole in that ship, all of them would eventually sink. And if they were to prevent them from making this hole in the ship, they would all basically be safe and saved. What is that? Let's see, this hadith is in al-Bukhari. What is that to tell us? That when we're speaking about sin, it doesn't just affect you, it affects the whole society. And whether we're speaking about a sin, whether you're basically making it public or you're basically making it private, at the end of the day, it's going to affect each and every single individual within the society. It's going to affect everyone without you noticing. And of course, certainly, if we would engage in forbidding what is evil, then that would basically mean it would save us all. And if we were to stay silent about it, it would get everyone else basically sinking. That's why, let's say, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَاتَّقُوا فِتْنَةً لَا تُصِيبَنَّ الَّذِينَ ظَلَمُوا مِنْكُمْ خَاصَّةً وَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّ اللَّهَ شَدِيدُ الْعِقَابِ. You could see that where this hadith was basically telling us to be careful from a certain fitna, that it doesn't just prick certain groups of people, but it basically would prick all the different people, and without us recognizing. Let's see, this hadith is in Sahih al-Bukhari. Let's look at this hadith. The Prophet ﷺ one day was asleep. He woke up from a dream and he said, لا إله إلا الله ويل العرب من شر قد اقترب فتح اليوم من ردم يأجوج ومأجوج مثل هذه وحلق بإصبعه الإبهام والتي تليها. So the Prophet ﷺ basically woke up and said, لا إله إلا الله, there is no God worthy of worship but Allah. Woe unto the Arab from an evil thing that had come near. Today, from the Gog and Magog, Ya'juj and Ma'juj, a small opening, and he had made a circle between basically, let's see, al-ibham, so basically the index finger and also the thumb, and he basically made a circle and said, this much has already opened from basically the lock of Ya'juj and Ma'juj when they were basically locked by Dhul Qarnayn. And Zainab said, O Prophet of Allah, would we actually be destructed when we have people that are pious within the community, amongst us? And the Prophet ﷺ said, yes, you would still be destructed إِذَا كَثُرَ الْخَبَثِ. If the evil was abundant, yes, certainly you could still be destructed if the evil was abundant. And in other words, it was, if it's numerous, if it was in large numbers, if it was, the behavior was just becoming so common that people would practice such an evil thing, that yes, it would actually be something that would destruct the society, even if there are still good people within the society. And this is extremely important to keep in mind, because if we don't actually consider making massive da'wah to change the evil, then you might actually need to change your place in finding a place that has more salihin in it. All right, I'm not going to spend more time, so you know what? Let me say this hadith right there. Let's say the Prophet ﷺ, this hadith is in a Sahihain. A Sahihain actually means in Bukhari and Muslim. So Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman, who basically had the most important signs and most important information in regards to fitan. He said, we were with Umar ibn al-Khattab, and Umar ibn al-Khattab said, who memorized the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ in where he talks about the signs of Judgment Day? And Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman, he basically said, I did. Umar ibn al-Khattab said, well, you are certainly lajari, you are certainly brave. And he said, how? He said, well, I heard the Prophet ﷺ say, فتنة الرجل في أهله وماله ونفسه وولده وجاره يكفرها الصيام والصلاة والصدقة والأمر بالمعروف والنهي عن المنكر. The fitna that a man would basically be in regards to his family, probably his wealth, probably his health, and probably his children, and probably the different things that basically with the neighbors, that siyam, fasting, and salah, and even donations in order for what is good would basically remove the different sins that one might engage in. Maybe your neighbors, they kind of got angry at you and they did, you probably said something not appropriate to them, etc. Or maybe your children, you smacked your child and it was probably in a situation that wasn't too fair. Or probably your child, you basically engaged in something that was probably not the best way with your child, but at the same time, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically, or the Prophet basically tells you that all of that, just by doing siyam, doing salah, and ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil, would remove all the sins that you might have actually committed left and right in your family, your mouth, and also your neighbors, etc. Umar said, I'm not actually asking about that. I'm actually asking about the fitna that would come, be like a strong wave within the ummah, like a wild wave coming exactly like the wave of an ocean. So Hudayf ibn Yaman said, well, don't worry about that, Amir al-Mu'mineen, because there is between you and that strong wave of fitna is actually a door that is sealed. But Umar ibn al-Khattab said, is that door going to be broken or is it going to be opened? So then Hudayf ibn al-Yaman says, as a matter of fact, it would actually be broken. So that's when Umar ibn al-Khattab said, then the fitan are going to never end because that door will always be open if it was broken. All right. And of course, the most important thing that when we're speaking about ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil, it basically increases your iman. It gets you stronger in your connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It increases your iman because the Prophet ﷺ, in this hadith of Abu Dhar, the Prophet ﷺ said, يُصْبِحُ عَلَى كُلِّ سُلَامَ من أحدكم صدقة فكل تسبيحة صدقة وكل تحميدة صدقة وكل تهليلة صدقة وكل تكبيرة صدقة وأمر بالمعروف صدقة ونهي عن المنكر صدقة ويجزئ من ذلك ركعتين يركعهما من الضحى. ليصبح على كل سلامة. In other words, with every single joint in your body, you would basically have to give a particular donation in that day. So in other words, for every single joint, you're going to consider that you've got all these joints, all these bones, and you're going to consider that every single day you have to do a donation to count as equivalent to the number of joints in your body. So every single tasbihah, subhanallah, subhanallah, that you would do would basically be a donation on behalf of that. If you would say alhamdulillah, that would be a donation. Kullu tahlila, la ilaha illallah, is basically what tahlila, it's an abbreviation for it. It's basically a donation on behalf of it. Kullu takbira, basically to say Allahu Akbar, that's a sadaqah. And ordering for what is good is a sadaqah, and even forbidding what is evil is a sadaqah, is a donation. And if you couldn't do all of that, it's enough for you to do 2 rak'ahs. Oh, look at that beautiful thing. 2 rak'ahs during الضحى. الضحى is basically, let's say, 20 or half an hour after sunrise until maybe 40 minutes before dhuhr. Let's see, this hadith is narrated by Muslim. Look at that. It's narrated by Muslim. In other words, it is basically one of the highest levels of hadith in authenticity. Let's see, what if I were not actually to do that? Let's see. This hadith, basically the Prophet ﷺ, a man would be brought on judgment day and they would be put in hellfire, in where all their intestines would basically be put in hellfire, and then they would basically go round and around and around and around. All right, exactly like you would basically ground just in the primitive way, ground different things, and where a donkey would go around, and they would basically, as long as they keep on going around, they would basically turn this rock basically over these these different substances in order to completely ground them. All right. And then the people of hellfire, they would basically come at this person and say, well, weren't you ordering us for what is good and forbidding us what is evil? And he would say, yes, I used to order you for what is good, but I used to still, I used to not do what is good, and I used to forbid what is evil and actually commit it. And you could see that that would be basically the punishment. Nas'allah al-afu wal-afiyah, for ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil would basically bring you also lots of good without you realizing. I'm just here, we're really we've basically passed our time, all right? But I really wanted to finish the page. So what should we do? Okay, I'll let you, Noura. Okay, I'll let you, Noura. Go ahead. Noura, you wanted to say something, dear. Go ahead.
I just wrote down some questions that I have. So for the forbidding what is good and I mean for the enjoining what is good and forbidding what is evil, not like we're in a non-Muslim country, you know what I mean? So what how is that a different
So it's really the same thing. So ordering for what is good in, if you're talking to a non-Muslim, would basically be that you're ordering them for tawheed. You're basically giving a reminder. And it doesn't necessarily mean, when we say order, it doesn't mean a commandment. Hey, you got to do your tawheed. Okay. It's not a commandment. It's basically bringing in an invitation, basically an invitation. All right. So just by doing that invitation, whether it's you've got a booth, you go to the masjid, basically contribute in probably building an Islamic school or inviting others to join a halaqah. Even, hey, let me invite all the people that I would know to come and join, for example, this halaqah. It's Zoom. Hey, it's easy. You don't have to leave your house. You could be at home. You can listen to it, and etc. That's actually being participants. You're being a participant in ordering for what is good and forbidding what is evil. So even although you're probably not doing the class, but by inviting others to attend the class, you're actually there in that situation. You're ordering for what is good. And this is al-mu'minun wal-mu'minat ba'duhum awliya'u ba'd. So we're all together in sailing in this boat in order to basically order for what is good and forbid what is evil. You don't necessarily have to conduct it in person, but just to remind others to join, to learn, to hold on to Quran, Islam, etc., all the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is actually part of it. Or sometimes to even do things differently. Maybe you're instructing your kids, hey, you've got a Quran class to go to. I want you to memorize, etc. Even if you're probably not doing it yourself, your kids might tell you, hey, you didn't memorize your Quran. You didn't memorize as much as we did. So why are you telling us to do it, etc. So in that situation, just even though you might not have done it, although would definitely be the best way to engage in it by being the good example, but at the same time, just by you trying to promote, to encourage, that's also amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar. And of course, people would have different programs.
Because I noticed like people are at different stages in their Islam, different abilities of understanding at different levels, not, you know what I mean? Like,
right.
So I think it would have to be on more of an individual level, like how you would talk to people, especially women.
Well, I mean, certainly the way that, subhanAllah, it's a skill. It's a skill. Not everybody has it. And certainly people have, Ya Allah, people would have different doors. All right. People had different keys, I guess, to their hearts. So it's not really the same. You might actually go and do dawah and it just, hey, people just didn't accept it from you. Someone else might not have given even a good argument as you have, but then I guess they weren't really looking for the argument. or at least the evidence. Sometimes it's just looking, sometimes at a moment of inspiration. You never know.
Yeah.
There were many times, wallahi al-azim. I mean, I have a PhD in Islamic studies, and my mom doesn't have any degree in Islamic studies. There were many times where she would come and tell me, hey, I want you to do dawah here and there. And I would be speaking for hours, giving a lecture in regards to something, and the people would just, completely not accept it from me whatsoever. My mom would go and talk to them in 5 minutes, and subhanAllah, the inspiration just reaches right away. So it's not always necessarily the argument. Sometimes it's really the inspiration.
Just speaking to their
Sometimes
heart
the
and
approach. Absolutely. So
Yeah.
if we sometimes we're just too focused on the evidence. Sometimes we're just too focused on the evidence that they're not necessarily looking for the evidence. It's more of an inspiration. Sometimes a moment. Sometimes people are just ready at that moment. Their hearts,
or encouragement.
or encouragement. At that moment, their hearts were ready to, were fertile to accept an inspiration. At other times, their hearts were just sealed. No matter what you said, no matter
Yeah.
what dawah you had done, their hearts are just sealed at that moment. So never stop. Never stop your dawah and think, well, I've tried, they're not convinced, that's it, I'm just going to move on. You never know. The hearts, they will change at one time. They might not have an open heart. On another day, they're just ready to accept the dawah. Don't stop. And never think that, oh, I've given up, I've tried before, they're not interested, and walk away. You never know. You never know.
Yeah.
Just continue.
Alhamdulillah.
So I hope if there's another question, I'd be happy to answer it, inshallah. Okay, so we'll end it right here, inshallah. And barakallah fikum, everyone. My son is excited that we're done. Okay. We'll stop.